Convention of the States. We won't go any farther, but it's a subject that a lot of us didn't really know about, so we've got the local expert in the field, Mr. Eric Meyer, the State Director. Please give him a warm welcome.
Thank you for having me. As mentioned, I am the State Director for the Convention of States here in Washington State. I've been in that volunteer position for about 2 years now, and been through the grind down there in Olympia for 2 years. We've been fortunate enough to get our bill sponsored both last session and this session. In 2016, we had 4 sponsors in the Senate and 8 sponsors in the House. And last year, we were able to up that activity level to 15 sponsors in the Senate and 16 sponsors in the House. Both years, we entered the Senate committee before the House committee, and we stalled in the Senate committee. And a couple years ago, I was probably a little bit more naive than I am now, and I really didn't understand how the whole process worked. But you could just be stalled there in whatever committee you get to. And we had a few folks that were opposed to what we wanted to achieve there, and so that's where we've stalled these last 2 years. For this upcoming year, I'm hoping that maybe we can manage to get into the House before the Senate just to have a little bit different action, I guess, but we'll see how that goes. So let's talk about Article 5 and what it is that we're trying to accomplish. So Article 5 has been in the Constitution from the very first day that the Constitution was ratified. In 1787, they were meeting at the Constitutional Convention to discuss it and debate it, and it was getting to the last day of the convention, and on that last day, somebody stood up, Colonel George Mason of Virginia, and said, hey, there's no mechanism in here for the people or the states to propose amendments. We only have one mechanism in Article 5, and that's for Congress to propose amendments if 2/3 of the members of each chamber of Congress propose the amendment. And he observed that Congress is never going to propose amendments that rein in their own power, and that's going to be a problem. Obviously, they knew from their experience that a national government could be tyrannical, and so this gentleman put forth the idea that we need to have a second mechanism, a mechanism whereby the states could propose amendments, and so that's what we got. The first mechanism is, of course, that, like I say, that Congress can do it, but the second mechanism is that if 2/3 of the several states propose that we have an amending convention, then we have an amending convention. And that thought was agreed upon by 100% of the framers at the Constitutional Convention, according to Madison's notes. They all were convinced that the national government would eventually become tyrannical, and that we needed a mechanism outside of Congress to be able to amend the Constitution and go around them, basically. So 200 years later, this mechanism has been attempted a number of times. By some counts, there have been some 400 applications passed by various states, and that's well above the 34 needed, or the 2/3 needed, and of course we didn't always have 50 states, so in previous times it would have been a lesser amount, but we've never quite made it to that 2/3 threshold. The balanced budget amendment effort came very close. They got up to 32 states, and that effort started in the 1970s and 80s. They got up to 32, and then some states repealed, went back down to the mid-20s. They never quite made it to that threshold. And there were some other times that it was getting close, and then the fact that it was getting close to the threshold kind of incentivized Congress to go ahead and propose the amendments that were going to be proposed. But here we are. So some of you may be familiar with Mark Levin, or many people in the crowd familiar with Mark. Okay, so you've probably heard him talk about this on his program. He published a book probably about 4 years ago now called The Liberty Amendments, and he talked it up a little bit before he did the big reveal like he's wont to do. And when he did, say that he was coming out with a book called The Liberty Amendments and talked it up, I went right out and I read it. And it's a pretty quick read. You can read it in one evening if you want to. And I agree with him. I was convinced that this was the mechanism that we needed to go after to try to rein in our uncontrolled federal government. And so several years went by from the time that he published that book to seeming like nothing was happening. And then finally, this Convention of States effort got some traction. It's founded by two guys, Mark Meckler, who was one of the founders of the Tea Party movement, and Dr. Michael Ferris, who was the head of the Homeschool Legal Defense Fund. He's also the chancellor of Patrick Henry University in Virginia, and was the co-founder of our effort until last year. And then he had some other big mission that he got invited to head up a worldwide group that is responsible for defending religious liberties, basically. So he kind of stepped away from this and is pursuing that, but he's still a supporter. And so anyway, those guys got traction on it, and 4 years ago, it started moving. And in the first year that state legislatures were pursuing this, or that the movement was going, it got passed in 3 states. Georgia first, then Alaska, then Florida. In the second year, we got one more state. It was Alabama. And then the third year, we got Oklahoma, Tennessee, Indiana, and who else did we get? Louisiana in the third year. And then this past year, 4 more states: Texas, Arizona, North Dakota, and Missouri. So we're at 12. We've got to get to 34 to call this convention. And the specific language that we are passing in all of these states says this: we want to call an Article 5 convention limited to these 3 things: imposing fiscal restraints on the federal government, limiting the power and jurisdiction of the federal government, and imposing term limits on federal government officials, including Congress. So 3 things. That's what we think the convention will be limited to. There are critics out there who say, no, you can't limit it. And we'll have a Q&A session. I'm sure we'll have some debate about that, but that's what we intend this convention to be limited to. And as I mentioned earlier, there's been some 400 of these applications passed by the various states in our 200-plus year history, and the convention's never been called. So that tends to indicate that if the subject matter of those applications wasn't important, then we would have had a convention called already. We passed the threshold a long time ago, so we have this precedent built up that the subject matter specified in those bills seems to have some weight, basically. So there we have it, and let's start with a few questions, I guess.
So I remember signing a petition, I guess that went to the state legislature, supporting this convention of states. So what's the status of that petition? What did that actually do for us? How many folks signed that petition in Washington?
Some 17,000 or so. 2 years ago when I started, it was about 6,000, and everybody who signs that petition, frequently they do it online through our website. And it accumulates on the website, and we have the capability, if we want to print them all out on a piece of paper and deliver them there, but there's some cost to that, and our national team is deciding what are the most likely targets to spend their money in. Certainly supporting all 50 of the states, but there's a few states that they actually have paid lobbyists and so forth. So we haven't yet pursued the strategy of actually printing out the petitions and bringing them to the legislators, but I'm there lobbying them all the time, and our team is lobbying them, and I'm certainly saying to them, hey, we've got 17,000 people that are supporting this, and constantly I'm sending out emails to that whole crew saying, please contact 3 legislators in your district and harass them and get them to pass this thing. And as I'm lobbying on Capitol Hill there, Capitol Hill, Olympia, all kinds of times the legislators are telling me, wow, you guys have a really active grassroots, and it's influencing this basically. So it's helpful, and they're aware that there have been a lot of petitions signed.
Okay, before we do the next question, because there are people in the audience that didn't hear the first one. So go ahead and raise your hands. I'll grab and I'll get a mic to you. So I saw 2 hands.
So I have 2 questions. To make this happen at the state level, do you need, do you have a particular representative or senator that is the person that you're sponsoring the bill, and who is that? And then the second question is, do you have a time limit among all the states that you have to get this done by before it dies?
Sure. Second one first. There's no time limit unless the states that pass their individual bills put a time limit in there.
Oh.
And I don't believe any of the 12 that have passed it have put a time limit in there. And it would make sense for, in most cases, they won't put a time limit in because they'll just be, the thing that they want to get passed, they'll be restricting the chances of doing that. As for our sponsors in the House, it's been Ann Rivers. She's a senator, excuse me, in the Senate. She's a senator down in Vancouver in District 18. And in the House, we've had two different sponsors. The first year we had Matt Manwiller. He's a representative out in District 13 in the Chelan area, I think. And then last year, Jesse Young, here in the 26th, has been our sponsor. All right.
Another question.
For the legislation in this state, did it die in committee or did it make it to the floor?
It died in committee both years. In both years, they didn't actually bring it up for a formal vote. The first year, it was a committee of 7 people, and Pam Roach was the chair of the committee, and she was sympathetic to us. And in fact, she had a long-standing 30-year friendship with our leader, Michael Ferris. And Mike Ferris came here from Virginia to testify at that Senate committee hearing. And he met with her in advance, and she didn't think we knew. We knew we didn't have the whip count in the Senate committee yet. And so she didn't ask for a vote on the day of the committee hearing, and then we had a couple of weeks before time would run out to try to get that support, and we weren't ever able to get that support, so they never called for a vote. Then this past year is a little bit different. They changed up the committees a little bit. It went from a 7-person committee to a 5-person committee. It was the same thing. We didn't have the numbers and the whip count in that committee to get passage. The chairman was one of our sponsors, and I kind of indicated to our Senate sponsor, Ann Rivers, hey, why don't we just go and call for a vote this year anyway, just to feel like we made more progress than the prior year. But they met behind closed doors, and they decided not to do that. We hit the time limit. There's some limit that if you haven't made it out of your first committee, that it just dies. And this last year was February 15th, and we didn't get the vote, so we died.
And we have another question back here.
Can this be done through the initiative process?
That's been proposed to me on a few cases. Now, constitutionally, the Constitution is very specific. It says, upon the application of 2/3 of the several states, 2/3 of the several state legislatures, specifically the legislatures. So the question becomes, can we do some sort of an initiative that compels the legislature to act on our behalf? I haven't tried to pursue that yet because it just feels like even a longer shot than Plan A. And I know from talking to Tim Hyman and other people, these things cost a lot of money, like hundreds of thousands of dollars, to have a real chance at going. I know the bathroom bill thing, they had a good crew of volunteers, and they still came up short 2 years in a row on getting the number of signatures. So I haven't tried to pursue that yet, but our team gets together and strategizes from time to time, and I'm sure that idea will come up again.
Question here.
One of the biggest questions I get from my community when I talk to them is they feel that you have a convention of states that it may get hijacked. You listed 3 things that they proposed all the states agreed to. And once they start meeting, how can we be assured it's not hijacked into changing the First Amendment, changing the Second Amendment, and they have to? What assurance do they have to stick to those 3 specific topics?
Yep.
Can't change it.
Yes, it'll be a multi-part answer from me. The first soundbiting one is we can't guarantee anything. I can't guarantee that a piano will come crashing through the ceiling right now and kill me, but I don't let that dictate to me how I'm going to live my life. Now, I think it's extremely, extremely long odds that would happen. And the things we're trying to do, they're completely in tune with what actually the Tea Party mission is. If you guys know what the Tea Party mission is, limited cost constitutional government, free markets, fiscal responsibility. 2 of those 3 is exactly what we're doing. Limiting the power and jurisdiction of the federal government, imposing fiscal restraints. 3rd being term limits. My point being, you'd think, some people would think that we get almost universal support from the right, but we don't. There are a couple groups on the right that don't agree with us. John Birch Society and Eagle Forum are those, and I bring that up because those are the popular arguments that they use. It's going to run out of control. And here's why I don't think it will run out of control, and even if it does run out of control, it doesn't matter. It takes 34 states just to call the convention. That convention can only propose amendments. If it goes crazy and it gets taken over by George Soros, they can't impose any amendments. They can't put any amendments into the Constitution. They can only propose some. And then in a completely separate process, it has to be ratified by 38 states, 3/4 of the states. Totally separate process. It's the same ratification process that the first mechanism uses, that when Congress proposes it has to go through. So we've had a number of amendments proposed by Congress that never got ratified. And so it's a tremendously high bar. And what I would put forth to you is, if they have enough support to get 38 states of ratification for some cockamamie amendment like, tomorrow we're going to be a socialist country, then that implies they've already got the 34 support they need to call their own convention for that kooky thing. So what I would say is, even if, and I don't think the convention will run out of control, let's just say, devil's advocate, that it does, there's a very effective safety mechanism that we can rely upon. Now, I'll follow it up by saying, I don't think for 1 minute that the convention will run out of control. It's got 200 years of precedent behind it. There's a whole, on our website, what one of our constitutional scholars talks about, that prior to the Revolutionary War, there were all kinds of these interstate conventions amongst the states, and there's a long history of them specifying an agenda and sticking to it. And you better believe if we have the first convention called in several hundred years, it's going to be scrutinized by everybody in the country, and I just suspect there will be a number of attorneys standing by to file injunctions and whatever to prevent it going out of control. But the safety mechanism is that it requires 38 states, a bigger number than the call the convention.
Additional questions?
As voters, that's all we can do is vote. It would be nice to know on your website which people in Olympia are supporting your effort, because that helps us determine when the election comes who to vote for.
Yes, and I do send out emails from time to time, but you're right, we do need to update our state website. We've got, in addition to me as state director, so we're trying to get all kinds of volunteers. I hope some folks in this room will volunteer when we're done here. So I should have mentioned that from the outset. Our strategy is to have a captain in each of the 49 legislative districts. We call them district captains, and it's their job to activate the grassroots army and meet with them and have these kind of debates and get them on board so that they'll show up down in Olympia when we have a rally and convince these guys to do that. In addition to that, we have a technical role called a state information analyst. They're in charge of getting our state website up to date. And I know that we did get it updated on that first year, and we lost a couple of our SIAs this past year. As you might imagine, people come on and they volunteer for a while, and then they filter off sometimes. So I could list them off to you right now, but I guess there's a pretty long list. There's 16 in the House, 15 in the Senate, so I don't want to bore you with that. But it's a good point, and I'll try to follow that up.
Okay, we have a question in the front.
We have the Constitution that is supposedly limited by the 9th and 10th Amendments. If we will not stop and say, we will recall you if you go against the Constitution, and give us departments like the U.S. Department of Education, etc., that do not belong up there. Why would we want to get a balanced budget, which then is general and unlimited? And so if we go the route of using our Constitution, doesn't that make more sense? The third thing on that is when you move all these things to the federal level, they can be treated away. How do we know that there's not going to be more things moved up there and treated away so that we are more captive of the UN?
Okay. Occurred to me as well. I bet you everybody in this room is frustrated. She's been really anxious back there. Everybody's probably irritated that our national government doesn't seem to follow the Constitution. I'm irritated too. And so how do we want to go rely on the Constitution to rein those guys in? And here's what I would say. They've gotten away with doing an end run around the Constitution by virtue of the fact of some colonial era language that in some cases was kind of general. You know, the preamble to the Constitution, the general welfare basically, and they pour all of their leftist ideology into that, and they just use it to justify everything. What you'll find is that from amendments 11 through 27, by and large, they've had to respect those amendments. Presidents are limited to 2 terms. There is no more slavery. The voting age is 21. You couldn't drink, and now you can drink. Pretty much, if you go through those from 11 forward, the language, by and large, is specific enough that there's no wiggle room. And for example, in Mark Levin's Liberty Amendments book, he puts forth amendments that there's no ambiguity about it. He does a term limits amendment that says you get 12 years in Congress, period. That can be 2 Senate terms, or it can be 6 House terms, or it can be 3 House terms and 1 Senate term, whatever the case is. 12 years and then you're done, and there's not wiggle room on that. So the intent would be to construct amendments that are as bulletproof as possible, to try to prevent them abusing it. So that was one part of your question. You had several parts to it. Did I cover it, or did I miss any?
Oh, well, part of it also has to do with the changes that we have to, a treaty can be taken. If you move the things up there, as we have done with education is all mixed up now in the United Nations. Why are we not holding them to the enumerated powers rather than going to what we call a balanced budget? It can be unlimited.
Okay, so it depends. Our legislation says it doesn't specify the language of these amendments. They will come together at this Convention of States, and they will debate about what the right language is. And in Mark Levin's case, it's not just a balanced budget. And our language says impose fiscal restraints on the federal government. So somebody might come up with a balanced budget amendment as part of that, but they might propose also something that says federal spending will be limited to 15% of GDP, for example. And that's specifically what Mark Levin advocated for. I agree with you. The Department of Education should not be a federal department. And Mark had a good idea that all federal departments automatically sunset every 3 years unless specifically reauthorized by Congress. We can debate what the proper amendment should be, but it seems folly to kind of just stand by and let it continue to go. We have one good mechanism at our disposal that might help. Nobody's really tried it for the 200 years here. So let's try something. And the thing that animates me is the debt. We're at 20 trillion in debt right now. We've got 320 million citizens in America. 320 million people divided by 20 trillion in debt is 60,000 per person. A baby gets born today and they're in debt $60,000. Are we going to take action on that? Are we going to attempt to take action? Or are we going to just let it go? I think we've got an obligation to take action. United Nations agreed. The things we're proposing are purely about limiting the federal government, not giving them more power. We want to limit them. That's specifically what our language says.
We have a couple more questions in the room, 3 now. I'm going to get to them.
We'll get to you.
So which committee will this go to in the state legislature?
In the House, it's called the State Government Committee, and,
Okay.
and in the Senate, it's pretty much called the State Government Committee as well.
But you don't know who's going to be the chair of that in the next session?
Probably the same as last session. And so in the Senate, last session, it was Mark Milosha. And on the House side, it was Zach Hudgens. So, Republican.
Hutchins or Ann Rivers?
Ann Rivers is not on the committee. She's our sponsor. She's our sponsor, but the committee chair, we don't, those committees are pretty much standing committees. Now, the members can change from year to year. I'm just saying last year on the Senate side, Mark Milosha was the chair and he was an ally. On the House side, Zach Hudgens was the committee, and in both years our bill never even made it into their committee to be heard.
In regard to the question about whether this convention could be taken over and be out of control, Mark Levin, I think, had the ultimate answer to that, at least it convinced me, and that is everyday district judges have been changing our Constitution now for years. The president with a phone and pen has been changing the Constitution. What is it that we want to look at this convention and say, oh, we're afraid it's going to be out of control?
Exactly. And one of our leaders made that exact comment. Runaway convention, Christ, we got a runaway Congress. And they're wrecking our country every dang year. I said the debt's 20 trillion, but that doesn't even begin to touch on the unfunded liabilities of estimated about 150 trillion. We're going bankrupt. So if you love your children and you want to leave them the legacy that we've all had, I think it's incumbent upon us to try to take some action.
We have some questions back here. I'll get to you with the mic.
How will the delegates to the convention be selected?
They will be selected by the state legislatures in each state, however they want to do that. It simply says upon the application of these state legislatures. So California will probably pick commissioners that we're not fond of, and Washington will probably do the same, but Texas will probably tend to pick some folks that are aligned with us. And right now, out of the 50 states, 33 of the states have both chambers controlled by Republicans, just for whatever that's worth.
How many delegates will be allocated for each state?
The history on this is each state gets one vote. So if Florida wants to send 5 delegates and California wants to send 45 delegates, that's fine. They will decide amongst their own delegates what their vote is on a particular issue, and they will get that one vote. Now, some of our opponents also contend that that won't be the case. The history and the preponderance of the history, not the preponderance, all of it shows all of these interstate conventions have always been one state, one vote.
Okay, another question here.
2 questions, actually. First, quick. Is the 17th Amendment considered underneath your limitation of the federal and power? And are there other proposals out there for a constitution of the states? I thought there was one that had like 30 states behind it already. Is that the case?
It is the case. So the one you're talking about is the Balanced Budget Amendment. That's been an effort that's been going on for 4 decades. Like I said, they made it up to 32 states, and they dropped back a little bit from states repealing. And I've been in touch with the guy who's the lead of the BBA effort here in Washington State. I consider him to be an ally, and he's helped me. He gave me guidance. You may or may not know that we were successful in getting support for our Convention of States effort added into the Republican platform at the last state convention, and he was helpful in kind of pointing me at how we might go about that. And then there's also another active effort around the country that's leftist originated. It's a group called Wolfpack, and they want to repeal overturn Supreme Court Citizens United decision, which was about campaign finance, and for most of us in this room, it would probably run amok upon our First Amendment rights, basically. So most people here probably wouldn't support that.
What about the 17th Amendment?
17th Amendment, I've had a different idea from several of our national leaders. My first thought was, even though I want the 17th Amendment to be repealed, I didn't feel like it exactly fit within the language that I described a couple of times. Mike Ferris, our national co-lead, thinks that it would fit under the umbrella of that, and he had kind of an explanation for how he thought it would fit under there. So I'm not sure is the answer. I hope we can repeal it. If we can't repeal it under this convention, if and when it gets called, then hopefully we've set the precedent for calling more of them where that could be repealed.
Okay, question here.
Just wondering if you brought information, print material.
I did. Back on that back desk there, we've got some printed material. It's pretty little, it's a short little flyer basically, but what I would point you at that has just a wealth of information is our website. It's www.conventionofstates.com, and you could just sit there and pour through that thing, click at every link, and there's all kinds of great information. The one that I particularly recommend is on the top menu on the top. It says Learn. That's the menu item, Learn, and the sub-menu is Surge Articles. And what those are, it's 22 articles that are just quick hitters right to the point. They're front and back on the flyer. And in the 2016 session, it was a 9-week session. What our strategy was to get those printed out nice and glossy. I picked 9 of the 22 articles that I thought were the best ones. And every week, we had our volunteers going down to Olympia, passing out one of those flyers to all 147 of the legislators. And it gave us a great presence. They saw a constant stream of our volunteers coming in every single week. And I read all 22 of those articles. You could spend 3 or 4 hours and read through all of them because they're so right to the point that they attack this Article 5 effort from a whole bunch of slightly different angles. Several of them are debunking the thought of a runaway convention and explaining why it won't happen. Sometimes we get some criticism that the 1787 convention was in fact illegal, but there's, talking points that explain how no, it wasn't illegal, and that the states were sovereign, they could call a convention if they wanted to. It started with the Annapolis Convention with a few states. Really, really, really good stuff. So you can just sit there and read through that, and it's really enjoyable.
Other questions? Raise your hand high so I can see. Okay. Hi, Joyce. Hi.
I have a question on the Constitution already. It doesn't have a balanced budget amendment in it, but it has a limitation of powers in right now. And there's a list of what the Congress can do and what they, if it's not in the list, they're not supposed to do it. So a lot of the cost overruns right now are because they're not following the Constitution. And if they did, that would be automatically a balanced budget, or well, a more controlled budget. So how is this going to help the Congress or the country adhere to the Constitution that we already have? And if you just balance the budget, like balance the numbers, you're going to sanction in unconstitutional things like the Department of Education, where you just balance it out so that it has less money, but it isn't even supposed to be there. So how is this going to address that? And also in the attempt to balance the budget, then you're going to open the door potentially for a hijack convention, so that's kind of a danger there.
Okay, so it was again touching on your comments, I think, touching on the theme. They're not honored, but they're not respecting the restrictions in the Constitution now. What makes you think they're going to respect the new amendments that you put in there? And all I can say is we'll try to construct the language precise enough that there is no wiggle room. And again, you've got your Constitution in your hand. I would read through those amendments 11 through 27, and I think on pretty much every single one of those, you'll find that we are in fact honoring them. There is no wiggle room. Presidents are restricted to 2 terms. There is no slavery. The voting age is 21. Women can vote. There's no thing out there that women aren't able to vote. So we will try to construct those as best we can. Now, balanced budget amendment is just one aspect of it. It doesn't say balanced budget amendment in our language. It says impose fiscal restraints on the federal government. So they might get. She wants to follow it up on this, so.
When you say we are going to word it, who's we?
The delegates, the commissioners to the convention. Our hope, the volunteers that are pursuing this, is that we will get people together at the convention and they will construct amendments that are precise enough in their language that it will limit the federal government. Now, we will have an opportunity to ratify those. 38 states will have to ratify them. If they brainstorm some amendments that are poorly worded, it will be up to us to accept or reject them. And it only takes 13 states to reject it. So it will have to meet with very broad approval. I'm noticing some displeasure from your facial expressions there.
Perhaps to help clarify, and I don't know if this is where she's going, that there's an application process with the legislature, and then presumably there's some staffing involved. Can you detail out how that occurs, maybe with a little more precise content?
Yeah, there's no staffing particularly. If you read Article 5, in fact, I'll read it here.
Well, I think when I say staffing, you're talking about people, right, that are going to get together to do stuff. That's staffing. So tell me how it gets to that.
The Constitution is what says it. It's a very short article, and it says nothing more than upon applications of 2/3 of the several states, we will call an amending convention. So the legislatures in each state by one way or another, with knives or fistfights or whatever, they will decide upon 1 or 2 or 10 commissioners from their state. They will arrive at a convention. They will argue about what the rules are at that convention, as we've been known to do from time to time at conventions. And ultimately, a set of rules will be agreed upon, and then they will embark upon their business, and they'll fight about it in the same way that our legislature in Olympia does, and they'll make proposals on what amendments should be, and they'll fight on them. And if 26 states agree and say yes on a particular amendment proposal, that amendment will make its way out of the convention, and it will go through the same ratification process that all the other 27 amendments have gone through, plus any number of other ones that weren't
So
ratified.
to be clear then, the legislatures will define the who and the how many and the position. Okay. And each state will do that independently based upon their own rules.
Absolutely.
Are there other questions? Yes, 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 yes.
I wish you had read what that states, because you will not find that any of the determinations of who's going to be a delegate or anything like that is listed.
That's what I said.
But Congress, according to the Constitution, they have the right to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers and all other powers vested by the Constitution in the government of the United States or in any department or officer thereof. This Article 5, it says Congress, Sept. So Congress makes all the terms, and that's the swamp.
All right, I've got a great answer for that, so listen up. The first batch of language that you read was presumably from Article 1, is that right? Article 1 lays out what the authorities are for Congress. This is Article 5, separate from Article 1. The Supreme Court has already held on several occasions that Congress has none of their Article 1 authority has a darn thing to do with Article 5. That is already settled. And Madison opined, and I think Federalist 78, that the wording of Article 5 is peremptory. Article 5 says, Congress shall call a convention upon applications of 2/3 of the several states. The wording is peremptory. There is no option in there for Congress to do anything other than call it. And if they try to do some goofy end run where they call it for 80 years in the future or something, well then maybe it's time to take up the pitchforks. But the fact of the matter is, there is a mechanism spelled out here. It's very short. It's right to the point. It says, when 34 states call for it, Congress shall call it.
Then the Congress makes all the
They do not. There's nothing in Article 5 that says anything.
Congressional Research Service.
Okay. So I could probably go get 50 different packets printed out from some source on the internet and come up with 50 different opinions. Just because some congressional staffer thinks some certain thing doesn't make it true. The Supreme Court has ruled. If you read Article 5, it's so short that there's almost no ambiguity to it. It's 34 states call for a convention, you get a convention, and then you propose amendments.
So it looks like we've identified a risk.
Yes, all right.
My name's Lloyd. I would just like to express the opinion that I think that calling one of these constitutional conventions would be a really risky thing to do, because I think that the probability is very high that more than half of the state delegations would be of a liberal bent and likely to propose amendments that we would not like. I think that it's just not smart to do this.
Okay. Let me follow that up. Go to the mic with us for a moment. And I'll start with the first question, which is, okay, what's your plan? for more than 100 years here now, I'll say 100 years because that's basically the progressive era. We have followed the plan of, okay, let's elect some conservatives and let's get this thing reined in. So what's your plan on how to rein in this debt, rein in the out of control federal government?
Well, I don't necessarily have a plan, I just think yours is better.
Okay. Some of us are trying, and so well, that's what we've been, like I say, that's what we've been doing for 130 years, 200 years, but I'm doing a shorter period of years because that's when progressivism really started taking off. And we vote for people who say they're going to do a certain thing, and then they don't do it. We had all three, branches of government with George Bush back in 2000. Republican in the executive branch, both chambers Republican, and we went from a debt of $6.5 trillion to $10.5 trillion in 8 years. In one president, we almost doubled the debt from all the previous 43 combined. Then it happened again with 44. It went from $10.5 trillion to $19.5 trillion, basically. So we can keep on with the same thing that's not working. I would take issue with your assertion that we're going to get liberal amendments out of this thing. I just mentioned that 33 out of the 50 states are both chambers Republican. I don't know necessarily why you think we'd get liberal proposals out of that. We might, and if we do, then it's going to be up to us to ratify or not, and it takes a super duper majority to go ahead and ratify that thing. But I just say, we can sit around and we can just drive that car off the cliff, but this is what the history is. We've got the benefit of being able to look back in recorded history, seeing other republics die for just this reason, and we can sit back and just let it die. It'll probably die after I die, so I can take that.
Okay, why don't we move on to some definitive questions that are more educational focused so we can learn about the process and see what we can determine later.
Back of the envelope calculations would say that in three states, California, New York, and Texas, you've got about 80 million people. They would have the same voting power as 3 states totaling 2.3 million people. With South Dakota, Wyoming, and Alaska, it doesn't seem quite equitable.
It doesn't seem quite what I didn't miss that. Equitable. Well,
Yeah, the one vote, one state.
Yeah, the precedence is that there's one state, one vote. That's how all of the interstate conventions have gone in the past. So, and it's, yeah.
Other question in the back, Tom? You're going to make me run all the way back.
Yeah, I'll be halfway. I'm just curious. I love that idea of term limits. So say that term limit passed. So Orrin Hatcher then be thrown out right then and there because he's passed 12 years, or will he get another 12 years and be 184 when he gets retired?
It depends on how the amendment is framed. Mark Levin's idea was, no matter what, you finish the term that you're in. We don't have some ex post facto law that can, throw you out on the spot. But I want to emphasize, Mark Levin isn't the master of this thing. He put forth a few ideas to get us thinking about it, and his idea was, yeah, you finish your term.
I say throw him out on the spot.
All right. Maybe you can be a commissioner and you can put
We have a question right here.
I'm going to kind of take you backwards in time. My question goes back to the prohibition passage, and I kind of thought it fell into the Convention of States because, and you can clarify where it went, because I remember a little history of it that the Congress really didn't want the prohibition because the booze was very profitable for many congressmen to be supplying, and so they were against the prohibition to start with, and then several women were pushing it. And so could you kind of go backwards in time and clarify how that
Yes.
amendment kind of got on, and then of course it got later repealed?
That's correct. So I mentioned in several cases, this mechanism has been attempted. and in a few cases, it was getting very close to the 2/3 threshold, and that prompted Congress to go ahead and act before we actually got to the threshold. I'm not as sure about the 18th Amendment and prohibition. That was certainly the case with the 17th Amendment. Now, a lot of people in this room probably don't like the 17th Amendment, but the 17th Amendment folks back in the early 1900s were pursuing a convention of states. It was creeping its way up to the 2/3 threshold, and Congress acted and preempted it, and they did that. So, yes, it's happened in the past. I'm not sure what the dynamics were on the 18th Amendment with prohibition, but I wouldn't be surprised to hear that there wasn't an Article 5 effort going that kind of kicked Congress along to doing that. It's not always going to be, the things that happen in our state legislature, the things that happen in Congress, they're not all things that we're all going to like. You know, the levers of our government are available to people that do things that we don't like as well.
Okay, I have two questions on this side of the room.
Do you have anything competing with this, do you have anything competing with this article that you've got going? Is somebody else trying to knock it down?
Well, there's people trying to knock it down, and there's also people that are pushing their own Article 5 efforts. There's the balanced budget folks pushing for an Article 5 effort, and there is the Wolfpack group that's trying to overturn Citizens United. And then there's us. Those are the three biggies. And then there's any number of groups that are advocating against us. On the right-hand side, there's John Birch Society and Eagle Forum are a couple of the biggies that don't like it for the reasons that you've heard in this room. They're afraid that it's going to be a runaway convention. And then there's a number of groups on the far left as well that are speaking out against it.
So I think one of the reasons that, at least in this state legislators would not support fiscal control at the federal level is they actually think they get free money from the federal government. And they really have no idea how much money we're spending in income taxes, sending it to the federal government, and then we have to beg to get some of it back. So I'm wondering, do you have an advocacy process with real information about how this is not the best use of their tax dollars of state constituents?
Yeah, it's mostly the materials that we have on our website. I mentioned how there's those 22 surge articles, and those attack the issue from several different angles. One of those was the idea, one of our state directors from Illinois, in fact, I'm on some national calls with the other state directors. She authored one of those, and she talked about the issue of donor states versus, I forget what she got, donor states versus the ones that are getting the money. A number of states give more money to the federal coffers than they get back in a very large measure versus some other states that tend to get more. Of course, a whole bunch of it gets lost just in the transaction fees, I guess you could say, in DC. But yeah, we try to educate them with those materials. And I was just having a meeting with one of our volunteers. I'm constantly out there meeting with new people that maybe want to get involved. And she happened to be pretty sharp, and she had started up a couple of nonprofits that had gone through the efforts of advocacy down in Olympia. She really wanted us to have a lobbyist, and if we had enough money, I said, yeah, I'd love to have a lobbyist. And our national team has done lobbyists in a few states, but we don't have unlimited funds. So I'm sure they've done the calculation that it's going to be a hard sell in Washington and Oregon and California. I know this. I knew this when I took on the job, that my chances of success were no better than 1 in 20 being optimistic about it. But you make the argument, you make the fight. You've got the folks on the left that are going to tend to not like limited government, and then I'm still going to fight people on the right who are worried about this runaway convention. I get a lot of pushback from the Liberty Caucus, people that I didn't expect to get pushback from, like Matt Shea. He's not a supporter. We're going to be down in Olympia this Saturday. There's this, actually the Peggy Hutton, you might know her. She's the Tea Party lead for the Narrows group. They're doing a freedom fair. I think they call it the Patriot Fair, down on the steps of the Capitol this Saturday. If y'all want to come down there, Marty McClendon and Doug Basler are going to be MCs. Who's the guy who's pushing? I'm forgetting his name on the campaign finance. Glenn Morgan will be the MC for the other half of the program. So we'll have a booth down there, and we just try to get as many grassrootsy things going as we can to try to influence those legislators. Matt Shea will be speaking down there. I will come up next to him and I'll stand next to him until he notices me, and I'll make one more pitch to him to try to get on board with it, but that's about the best you can do.
Okay, we're starting to get some repeat questions, so is there anybody who hasn't asked a question? We've got about 5 minutes left on our time. Is there anybody who hasn't asked a question and would like to make one? Okay. So we'll take one more question here in the front, and then we've got a student that's going to ask an unrelated question.
I've been looking on who's dealing with this and such, and there are some of them that want to do away with the electoral college and have the popular vote. Well, in that case, we might as well forget being a state, because we would end up with California and we would have their rules, et cetera, et cetera. Yep. Is there any way to stop that? That would be a proposal.
That'll be a proposal at the convention? Okay, well, at the end of the day, we are a republic. I would disagree with that, but if somehow our opponents, our ideological opponents, I would say, can take over the convention and they can get something like that proposed, getting buy-in from 26 states, including the Texases and the Oklahomas and all those states that have Republicans controlling both chambers, still has to come through to ratification by 38 states. And at the point that we've got 38 states that are so far off the cliff that then we've lost anyway at that point. So I'm not going to use the tools at my disposal. I mean, put it to you this way. If you go to cut down a tree with a chainsaw, yeah, there's a chance you could cut off your arm, but do we not use tools just because there's a chance that something bad might happen? No, we have to use the tools at our disposal to try to get the outcomes that we want. So I'd be amazed if somehow the outcome of one of these conventions was something abolishing the Electoral College. I don't see how it could happen.
Okay, thank you, everybody. Give our speaker So we always try to give a gift. I'm not forgetting about it. And so we hope that he will use this in front of Matt Shea.
I will. We've got a form back here to sign up if you want to volunteer. We need more volunteers.
Thank you. Thank you. Give him a round of applause again. So we're going to ask a tough question. And it's tell everybody who you are. We're going to
So my name is Jacob Kirschbaum. I'm one of the students from Central Kitsap High School. And just during that speech, it sounded like there's opposition among people in the Tea Party for the 17th Amendment. I was just kind of curious as to what that opposition is.
Great question.
I was wondering that myself.
It's a good question. It's the popular election of senators is the 17th Amendment.
Does anybody want to address that?
What is the 17th?
Okay, do I have a, do you want to read it? Because I'm not going to recite it because I get it wrong completely. Do you have it memorized?
No, but I can never say what it is.
Okay.
You want to know what it is? You know what it is. You just want to know why anybody would be against that. Is that it? Yeah.
So it's apparently.
Johnny, she's got it right here. I've got it right here.
Did you read the amendment, please?
I'll read it. The Senate of the United States shall be composed of 2 senators of each state, elected by the people thereof of 6 years, and each senator shall have 1 vote. The electors in each state shall have the qualifications requisite for electors of the most numerous branch of the state legislatures. When vacancies happen in the representation of any state in the Senate, the executive authority of each state shall issue writs of election to fill such vacancies, provided that the legislature of any state may empower the executive thereof to make temporary appointments until the people fill the vacancies by election as the state legislature may direct. This amendment shall not be so construed as to affect the election or term of any senator chosen before it becomes valid as part of the Constitution. Well, that's a bunch of gobbledygook.
Does anybody have any?
No, you can't.
I gotta have an answer for it if you want.
Hold on. This is about as impromptu as it gets, meeting.
Prior to the 17th Amendment being passed, the senators were chosen by the legislatures of various states. And this ran into problems because some, like I think it was Senator William Clark of Montana, paid each legislature $10,000, and they put him in the Senate. So there are a number of cases in which there is outright corruption in that way. There's also a case where legislatures couldn't decide on a candidate, and so some states didn't have senatorial representation. So that was two of the reasons that the 17th Amendment was passed. Now, some people feel that it's better to have the state legislatures deciding who's going to represent the state than the vote of the people. And they have various, part of the problem is, of course, that state legislatures can be gerrymandered, and you'll come out with entirely different results of who's going to be on the Senate if it's a gerrymandered legislature determining it versus a popular election.
And we had another narrative back here.
So yeah, prior to the 17th Amendment, the state legislatures picked the senators, and the founders did that for a specific reason. They had all kinds of subtle checks and balances written into the Constitution. The three different branches of government, the most populous, the people's chamber was the House of Representatives, and for that they did direct election of the people. But they made a conscious decision to give the states a say in what happened in the federal government. So they made a specific decision to have state legislatures pick the senators versus the people picking the House members. Now, at the start of the progressive era in the 1900s, there was all this progressivism about, power of the people and everybody gets a vote and so forth. And based on that, the movement started to have the senators directly elected by the people. Sounds good, it sounds like everybody gets a vote, but the founders were quite wise, and they did it for a specific reason. They wanted the states to have a voice in the federal government. So for the people that can understand that nuance, a lot of us would prefer, and it's advocated by Mark Levin a lot, that it go back to that original mechanism, that the state governments have an actual say in what happens in the federal government.
And we'll take one more bit of commentary here.
If I could follow up on his comment, I think the main reason that conservative people would like to see it go back to the way it was originally is because the senators in the United States would not be telling the states what they're going to do. Rather, they would do what the states want them to do. So this popular election of senators is not, it's turned our national government into controlling everything, because the states are benevolent to, I don't know if that's the right word.
Subservient.
Subservient, thank you. The states are subservient to the federal government because they put them in that place. For example, you have to get the grants, right? Why do they have the money? Because they let the state senators, the federal senators, pass all these bills and set it up so that they blackmail the states into going for their programs. And so I'll stop there, but it just would bring the power back to the states if the state legislatures elected the senators, in my belief.
So we start out with a good informative evening about convention of the states, and we end up with a very small debate on the 17th Amendment. Thank you to our constitutional scholars out here. We appreciate that. We're at a time when we're ready to close our meeting, unless there's any, I don't know what that means.
Johnny, here's a whole section that refutes that. And this is Chris
Refutes
Ann Hall.
what?
Chris Ann Hall.
Okay, refutes what?
it refutes what, if you look in there, it refutes a lot of what is being said on the Constitutional Convention.
Okay. And so she's advocating this book
Read it.
to read. There you go.
You have a bowl up
Yes,
there?
I do. So, since nobody said that's mine, I'm going to presume that nobody recognizes this bowl. It was left at the picnic, and we're looking for its proud owner. And it's Corellware, and it's supposed to be very nice.
Well, it matches ours, I'll take it.
Oh, matches yours.
But it's not.
Oh, and we have some reading glasses. Okay, so if you're missing some reading glasses, what did you like? Find any money? Anybody? Speaking of money, I'll just remind you one more time. This is important to us. I feel guilty sometimes asking, but I'm going to do it anyway. And if you feel so inclined to donate to our organization, we appreciate it. Thank you to, by the way, our Libertarian friends just had an election. Roy, would you like to make that acknowledgement?
Thank you, Johnny. Roy Runyon, Chair of the Libertarian Party. So Alan Matthews here is our Vice Chair. He also ran for City Council in the city of Bremerton, District 1. Lost in the primary, but he worked really hard. So he's a hard worker. We need more folks on the ground who are able to put the effort in, willing to put the effort in to change our system and change things for the better. Al, can I give Alan a moment to talk if he wants to?
Sure. Yep.
Alan, you want a moment to talk if you want to? So, as I looked at the Vice Chair of the Libertarian Party of Kitsap County, and I plan on continuing to push on some of the issues that I had while I was running for City Council. One being the hospital situation we have in Bremerton, and the other one being the water issue that we are being self-taxed, and nobody wants to listen at City Council about it. Hopefully next year there will be a voter initiative on the ballot to rein in the spending and the wasteful theft that's going on with our water bills.
Great. Give him a round of applause for his position. We are building and continuing to build a very strong relationship with the Libertarian Party of Kitsap County, and we hope to be coming to an agreement soon in the near future on a short list of things that we can work on very actively together. As we build coalition partnerships with other groups, you'll see that next year is going to be a very important year. Does anybody deny that? Or about that? Next year is going to be a huge year for elections and initiatives. And so we need to become even more active than we've ever been before. We need to be active on the street. We need to be active on the phones, with our pens, our keyboards, and our time. And you will hear us ask for that and try to recruit you to help us out and find people in your neighborhood that will listen to your influence and get them involved. Because we can't do it together just in this room. We have to reach out to other partners. And we're blessed to have strong relationships with the Kitsap Rifle and Revolver Club, the Kitsap County Republicans, the different Republican women's groups, the Libertarian Party, the Kitsap Alliance of Property Owners. The challenge we continue to always have is we have different sets of priorities. And so strategically, imagine if we can agree to the top 3 or 5 priorities to work on together en masse, and perhaps we can make a different level of impact. And I'll encourage you to help us with that. Are there any other announcements tonight? And I would just ask, the weather is not yummy. It's a little bit nasty out there. Thanks again to our students who have showed up. Great question, prompting that little debate. We appreciate that. I hope you got something out of it. And drive safe. Thank you.